The United States must not be the first person to use this horrible new weapon. And so those students, and this is a very easy argument to accept, to sympathize with. And so those students are kind of puzzled that Harry Truman instead gave the order to drop the bomb. Not just once, but twice. So how do I explain that to my students? It's not so much that I need to explain it. What I need to do is to make it understandable to students. The fundamental job we as history teachers have, I think the fundamental job of historians, those people who write history books, is to recreate the mindset of an earlier era, to answer the basic question that might sound flippant, but I don't mean it as flippant at all. The basic question is, what were they thinking? So what was Truman thinking? And when I try to recreate the mindset, I can make the arguments in favor of dropping the atomic bomb. Now here, I have to be careful, because I don't want to come across sounding as an apologist for Harry Truman. And it's probably fair to say that, I don't know, mainstream thinking in the United States today looks upon the dropping of the bomb as, at the very least, regrettable. And some people would say, heck, it was evidence of this racist tendency toward genocide in the American councils of power. Almost nobody, I won't say nobody, but almost nobody is willing to defend it enthusiastically, to say, hell yes, and if we would have had 5 bombs, we should have dropped them all. But in fact, that attitude was much more common in 1945 than the opposite, that we shouldn't drop it at all. The folks who said don't drop the bomb were really in a minority. The folks, if you had put this vote to a referendum of the American people, and it wasn't, so I can't say with real confidence what the answer would have been, but I frankly don't have any doubt myself that there would have been at least an 80% majority in favor of, yeah, hell yes, drop all that we got. Why? Well, in the first place, Japan had started the war. In the second place, this was a long and brutal war. Everybody had already crossed the line between exempting non-combatants from the violence of war. The Japanese had started it in Nanking in 1937 when they raped and murdered 300,000 people in that Chinese city. The Germans, of course, had unleashed that kind of vengeance on Britain during the Battle of Britain, and then, of course, there was the Nazi Holocaust. And Americans and British had essentially bought into the idea with a strategic bombing campaign against Germany and against Japan. And so there were a lot of people who said, you're getting compunctions now, for heaven's sakes? Then there was the whole issue, and here's where I caution my students all the time against cheating on the wisdom of hindsight and knowing how things did turn out. When I said that the argument against using the bomb was, hey, the war's nearly over. In fact, Truman didn't know that the war was nearly over. Truman had every reason to think that the Japanese would fight even harder to defend the homeland than they had fought defending mere rocks of islands in the Pacific, where they had fought to the very last man and inflicted horrendous casualties on the Americans while accepting horrendous casualties themselves. Now, you don't have to accept some back-of-the-envelope estimates that 500,000 Americans would have died or been wounded in an invasion of the Japanese homelands. You don't have to do that. And historians have gotten themselves worked into a lather, trying to say, well, nobody took that number seriously. Truman just pulled it out of the air, as though that were a big issue. No, in fact, I happen to think that if Harry Truman had been told, you know, if we have to invade the Japanese home islands, it's going to require another 1,000 American casualties. Not 500,000, 1,000. He would have said, yeah, use the bomb. By the summer of 1945, nobody had any mercy left in the tank at all. This war had gone on for a long time. There was too much blood that had been spilled. And Truman said in his memoirs, and I don't think he was just making this up, that he would have had to worry about investigations of his conduct had he not used the bomb. Imagine if, well, I've known of people, parents of my contemporaries, who were in the Army and in the Air Force, the Army Air Corps, during the war, who had fought the campaign in Europe to a successful conclusion, who had come back across the Atlantic to the United States, who were en route across the United States and were about to ship out for the Pacific. And they took the attitude, and you would too, I think, wait a minute, we won our war, now we've got to go fight another one? Imagine if it had become known after the fact that the United States had these bombs, but out of a fit of moral high-mindedness, he had not used them. And suppose your father had been one of these people who had to go off to Japan and was killed after the president could have won the war. You'd have been pretty ticked off too. And so Truman said that he gave the order to drop the bomb and didn't lose a night's sleep over it. I don't know if I'd believe everything that Truman says on that point, but I certainly think that he felt he was justified in using it. I'm not going to say that he was justified or he wasn't. That's not my job as a historian. My job as a teacher of my students, as an author of history books, is to say, this is what people who opposed the use of the bomb were saying. This is what people who supported the use of the bomb were saying. This is what Harry Truman said he was thinking. This is what happened. I have sufficient confidence in the intelligence of my readers and of my students to make up their own mind. I don't want to make up their mind for it. I tell them again and again. I don't care what they think. I simply want them to think. And I want them to be informed thinkers on the subject of history. And if I can get them to do that, then I will have served my purpose. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience.